I would ask, is there any apologies, and give Rob Davidson's apologies?
Chairman, apologies for Councillor Brodie and Councillor Maitland substituting for Councillor Brodie at the meeting.
Thank you. Can I go to the second item on the agenda, declarations of interest? Any member has any declaration at this point? Thank you. Item 3 on the agenda, minute of the meeting of the 11th of March. Propose and second minute. Tom, thank you. I'm happy to second. Any matters arising from that minute? Yeah. Okay, item 4 on the agenda, review of schemes of delegation, scheme of administration and delegation to committees, report by Director of Chief Executive Services. Claire, I believe, is here to field any questions that would have been directed at the Director, who is on holiday at the present. So any members, any questions?
Chairman, can maybe help
on the roof of his house with a dormer window, I believe.
maybe speak briefly to the report. Just say, I think you're all aware the review's been ongoing for some time now. Said to the Chairman, we've been reviewing standing orders and schemes for about 20 years, but we don't seem to get too much further forward. But I think the aim is to have a set of recommendations to the full Council in June. That agenda for that meeting notwithstanding, there's other big issues on it. I did do some initial consultation with groups. I didn't get around to every group, unfortunately, last year. And the comments are actually listed in the report, or a summary of them at least. I got the impression that the scheme was largely fit for purpose. And we're not looking at kind of whole-scale changes. But obviously I'm in the subcommittee's hands on that regard. I didn't think we were going to go down the lines of cabinet structures or themed committees or any sort of fancy stuff like we have at other councils. But there's also an outstanding remit for this subcommittee to also give consideration to the longer term remit of the new police and fire subcommittee in terms of community safety and public protection. So that's an issue for this committee to advise the full council on that. Chairman, it's for you to decide how you wish to approach this, but perhaps if we just went through the current scheme page by page, because notwithstanding we have the delegations to look at, there are other issues in the scheme that maybe would raise some questions or comments from members. But I'm in your hands as always.
Members, any opinions on the back of that? Happy to go through the current delegation page by page. Councillor Maitland.
Could I just say that Claire, you mentioned that nobody seemed to be interested in themed committees. I think we'd like to sort of pick that one through, because it might well not be themed, but I would have thought we do need to think about how we make certain that we cross-cut between committees. So possibly not themed, but I do think that we need to lay an emphasis upon how we make sure that we're covering, well, I suppose I'm talking about the outcomes issues which do cross-cut across all committees. So while I understand, that maybe the sort of nuclear option of themed committees might not be what came out of the consultations, I certainly think there is some work to be done.
No, I totally agree with you. I think there's always a bit of dubiety sometimes as to where a report should go, or should it go to more than one committee, and I think delegations as they stand certainly need firmed up in that regard.
Okay. Do you think, Jane, that that's something that would come out of our discussion, the delegation and the page-by-page process? Yep. Okay, so page 13 of 34. Thanks, Claire.
Chairman, these are just statutory, not statutory, but sort of standard, I should say, introduction that we've always had in the scheme. At one introduction, 2 are the powers reserved to the council. These are statutory exclusions that only the full council can determine these issues. So I don't think there's anything there that perhaps we need to look at this present time. The non-statutory exclusions are listed there. Again, they've not really changed much over the years, other than the granting the freedom of Dumfries and Galloway which was remitted to the full council. But I don't know if any members have any comment on what's listed in the statutory and non-statutory exclusions. Are they fit for purpose?
No.
Yep. I'm having to Clark and take notes here, so bear with me. Section 3 just goes through committees, standing subcommittees can only be established with the approval of the council. However, we do have a number of kind of single issue ad hoc subcommittees which have cropped up over the years. They're really for single issue. They have to have a definite remit and timeline, and I don't think we've abused that over the years. We have the welfare reform ad hoc coming up. We have this ad hoc, and so I think that's how it should be. Standing subs are for the full council, ad hoc permitted for single issues. I don't see any issues with that. At 3.4, obviously, we've appointed the following committees. I've underscored over police and fire on the current scheme because obviously that's come out now. We have our local review body, our planning applications committee, and the civic government licensing panel. The PAC and the panel were established a couple of years ago as the quasi-judicial functions. The constitution, again, fairly standard. Maybe get on to, when we come to the appendices, looking at the appointment of the religious representatives onto the education committee, because there's a bit of an issue there that was raised at full council last week about education issues that maybe discussed at full council. How does that leave the 3 religious representatives in terms of their ability to vote on matters of an education nature? We took the view a while back that teacher reps could speak but were statutorily barred from voting on any matter. I think that's, we found that we'd been doing the wrong thing for a number of years and quickly reversed that.
That's it now? Yep. Because there was no stat. I mean, we're one of the few authorities that still allows teachers to sit in the education committee because there's no statutory right for them to sit there now. But it was a fact that I think it was John Major's government, they abolished the right for teacher reps to be there, but this council and its predecessor kept it running.
1989 Act that allows the church or the religious reps to vote, and they are the only ones currently non-elected members that can vote on a council committee. 4.3, we have invites to the Chair and Chief Executive of Dumfries and Galloway NHS to attend all meetings of the social work services, but I can't recall having seen either of them at recent meetings, so I'm not wondering if that's something that needs to be looked at. Um, 4.6, quite important. Made a slight change to that back in November, that's for political groups to name their members on committee, and it's up to the group leader to advise of any amendments to those representations on committee. And we put in the addition that if a member's like to be absent for a period of 3 months or more, they can change the membership, so we don't have people swapping around because they're away on holiday for 2 weeks or any such thing. Then go on to look at area committees and the issue about they can co-opt community reps if they wish, but these reps will have no voting rights. Subcommittees will consist of members of the parent committee in such numbers as agreed, and something to be aware of, that substitution on subs is for the whole meeting. I have seen instances where substitution has taken place for one item and I have had to correct that. So I think it's quite important that officers and members are aware of that. We have our 4 liquor licensing divisional boards. These are not committees of the council. And we recently put into the scheme about member officer working groups. Now, I'm not aware of a huge amount of member officer working groups going on at the moment, but we have established protocols for dealing with them. They're not subject to standing orders, so they're not public meetings. And then we move on to delegations chairman. So, do you wish to go through each committee one by one and just give comments, or do you want to look them in together, or I'm in your hands? Yeah. So we've got policy and resources. So obviously, Resources Committee of old was merged with the Corporate Policy Committee and created a rather huge remit and equally large agendas at each meeting. I think that was the one where I went around the groups. There was a few issues about how Community and Customer Services reported as a service to the P&R Committee. So I think that's probably one that I would imagine members would wish to look at as to what it actually has as its delegation.
Yeah, it's certainly one that we made a submission on, that that is only service that the public choose to use. They choose to use our libraries, leisure centres, etc., etc. And that really should have a committee on its own, because it does require to be kept an eye on. You know, there's occasions there where things happen that elected members are not aware of, policies are changed by officers, because we're not getting a proper report back that we used to on a lot of these services. And I really feel that elected members should have a greater input. Because what tends to happen at the moment is, although it comes to the policy committee, they're usually shoved right at the end of the agenda, and that's always towards the end of the day. And I don't think that quite often a lot of these things get the time they deserve. So I really think the whole community services, customer services side should be taken out and handed over to a separate committee. I think, again, there's things that the policy committee should be looking at, because it is the resources committee which really took over from the old asset management committee, where we were having an overview of personnel, procurement, property. Now, all these things should really come into the policy and resources committee as well, unless you want to have a separate resource committee. And I mean, I would say that where you've presently got the employment and appeals committee, that should be disbanded, and that should just be subsumed into the policy committee for all the times that it meets. Because I think if you're going to set up a new committee, you've got to sacrifice an old committee. And there's a couple of committees further on that I think we should get rid of as well, but I think there's other committees that need to be created, because we should be able to respond to what the public are consuming as customers, if you like, and we're not doing that at the moment.
Thank you. Colin?
I mean, I agree certainly on the community and customer services. I think that deserves a committee in its own right. It must be the only department of the council that's kind of stuck in another service committee, if you like, and I think that's unfair to that particular department. It's an important department, has a significant budget, and I think a separate committee would allow it for the scrutiny. I think the issue of having 30 items on the agenda, policy and resources, means that the reality is we are not scrutinising departments as well at that committee as we should be. So I think that's almost a no-brainer. I think the other one that the Labour group were discussing, we weren't entirely clear what the best solution would be from that committee was actually what we do in terms of chief executive services. We were quite clear that policy and resources committee was almost a strategic committee of the council. It wasn't a service committee, it was a strategic committee of the council to look at the various things, that the strategic oversight, etc. But chief executive services were still a department of the council, and what do you do with that department in terms of who does that report to? Is it appropriate to still report to policy and resources, or should it report elsewhere? So that was the one that we talked about but didn't really come up with a solution. But I think everybody in our group were clear that the community and customer services should be a committee very much in its own right.
Thank you. Jane?
I take a slightly different view, not because I don't think it's incredibly important, but I think we're in danger of giving services an undue importance as opposed to what we're actually trying to achieve. I would suggest that these services need to be have perhaps not a separate committee, but I certainly think they need a separate meeting. And I would think that that might be the way of according them the importance that they need. Because, I mean, what we're trying to do is use these services to achieve the outcomes we've decided are right. I think it's a grave danger to allow officers and employees to think again in a service structure as opposed to an outcome structure. And I would just say that could we give accord them the importance, not so much by a separate committee, but probably by agenda management.
I certainly get the sense that you're talking about a line of accountability, which is perfectly sensible on the surface of it, but it's what they're actually doing then that would be better scrutinised. But how do you channel that to ensure that you've got that line of accountability? Ivor?
Chair, I think CCS is one that's going to cause issues. If you take the customer services where you're actually coming in to access maybe benefits, advice, etc., I think that should stay as part of the actual policy resources, because you've got the revenue part in there, you've got the finance department in there, and that, I would say, ties together. The likes of your sport and leisure facilities, well, currently we know that we have a lot of sport and leisure facilities that we can't access because they sit in education, they're playing fields. Now, would it not be better if they were actually looked at in a holistic view, that school playing fields against community playing fields were the same thing, so why can't they all sort of be managed in the same area? So I think the way you look at it has to take into account what you have in other areas as well. It's not a case of you put back the old Community Resources Committee, because the problems we had there with Community Resources had this, schools had that, and there the twain shall meet. You get £15 for this one, £5 for that one. I think you need to have some sort of buy-in across all the facilities that we have. I think the policy and resources should take into consideration political activity of the council and all of the resources that we have, whether it's assets, etc. So maybe the playing fields as an asset has to be looked at differently because of the service level, but the actual strategy for that, I think, needs to stay with policy resources.
So you wouldn't look favourably on a splitting of policy and resources into two separate groupings?
Well, to me, if you set a policy, you need to know where the resource to do that policy is. So I think you need oversight of both of them in one committee.
Thank you. Colin?
The difficulty with that is that you could argue the same for education, and that should come under the remit of policy and resources as well, because they've got resources in playing fields. So, I mean, that's where I got difficulty with Jane's comment that it should still come under the remit of policy and resources, because actually that argument is the same for every department. So social work should come under policy resources, everything should come under policy resources. So I can't get my head around that particular argument. And in terms of the playing fields issue, well, that's a policy issue in terms of it's a decision. The council, in my view, and I agree, needs to get a grip of the fact that half of resources in terms of playing fields and halls, etc., are with education and half are with community services. That should be sorted out. It's ridiculous that we have a two-tier service, and difficult is actually hiring a hall in a school because you need to get a janitor from the education department, all that issue, but that needs to be sorted out. That, in my view, is not a committee structure problem, that's a policy problem that needs to be sorted within the council, to be perfectly honest. I come back to the point again that there is a lack of scrutiny of that department because of the committee structure, that it does not get the same. If you look at the fact that we have a housing subcommittee of the council and we don't actually have any houses, yet there's a significant amount of scrutiny of our housing policy, yet when it comes to community customer services, we've got swimming pools, we've got sports centres, etc., and it's tagged on at the end of a 25, 30 item agenda of Policy and Resources Committee. I just think that is not given a fair scrutiny of that particular department. So I think that is an issue that really needs to be resolved. I don't see the difference between having a separate meeting and a separate committee. I don't understand how that would work. If you have a meeting to discuss community and customer services, then it is a community and customer services committee that day. If it's got the same members as Policy and Resources Committee, then frankly that's up to the groupings, I suppose, to decide who's on the committee. But I really do think that's one that needs to be. I think we've got to look at the way in which Policy and Resources works at the moment, and it doesn't work effectively at the moment because there are far too many items and not enough issues are being properly scrutinised. There are a lot of important issues at the last meeting of Policy and Resources, and it happens time and time again, that were effectively rubber stamped because people were conscious of the fact that they were about to sit there for the next 4 or 5 hours going through these things, and I don't think that's fair, to be perfectly honest. So I do think the starting point from us is, if you're not going to go down the route of themed committees and you're not going to go down the route of a radical revamp, then the starting point from us, from Policy and Resources, is you have to reduce what goes to Policy and Resources to make it an effective working committee of the Council.
I mean, there's an issue with agenda management and the roll forward business plan. The P&R is the biggest committee, and the fact it meets bi-monthly is maybe an issue as well. That you have monthly meetings, but for the rest of a year, it's planned as to what goes to that committee, and it stays that way. And items don't just get put on at the last minute because an officer needs a report up. So there is an issue for us as officers to make sure we manage that roll forward to the best advantage. So perhaps bi-monthly meetings aren't effective.
Tom?
Yeah, I think Ivor made a good point about the education. I mean, when this council was set up, we actually had an Education and Community Services Committee. That was the very reason for setting up, because of the overlap between education, not just playing fields, but school halls, that kind of thing, which were community resources. And that existed for 4 years. And one of the things they did was to bring the charges for playing fields, football pitches especially, and halls, into line. Then the council, in its wisdom, decided to split that. And of course, you've got this divergence again between the charging policies of education and community resources. I think, historically, if you go back when education had the career service, the further education colleges, the employment service, the libraries, school meals, all that kind of thing, it's been rather slimmed down. So taking something away that isn't mainstream education might concentrate the department more on what it's there to do, and that's to provide education for nursery, primary and secondary pupils, and allow the community services department to look at the utilisation of the assets that are there vis-a-vis the school halls, the school playing fields, etc., and get a consistency of charging across the piece. So I think that's a fair thing to be looked at, that aspect of education could be taken away. I take on board what Ivor says as well about the benefits side. I think that's one that on an operational basis remains within the community services side, but on a reporting basis would come to the policy committee, because the employees are basically in finance, which is a policy function. So it's not impossible for the bulk of the service to go to a separate committee and take over issues from the education committee for the education department.
Ivor?
Chair, maybe we could follow the police and fire model, which was police 1 month, fire the next. We could have CCS 1 month, CES at Policy and Resources the next.
Jane? No?
I'm just going to say that, I take the point that they are bi-monthly. We wanted to suck it and see, we wanted to reduce the number of times we were meeting, but it just might be the case that we do have to accept from time to time in order to get this very big agenda dealt with. But at the same time, I think we want to concentrate on what you do. It shouldn't take ages to decide what you want to achieve using those assets. The time's taken is making certain that it's actually done on the ground. That's where you want to see, what's actually happening. And you also want to see locally, I think, you want to try and get services together to see what you're getting for the pound right across the services. I'm just concerned that if we set up something individual, we'd start to get these divisions in people's minds, which we are absolutely trying to get away from, which is what I was talking about, the fact that Revs and Bens and CCS and all these sort of things actually are customer services, and that's where the way they've got to stay. So, I'm sort of, I am resisting going back to anything which looks at all like a service-led and specific and narrow silo-based committee.
For somebody that didn't really have anything to say, can I turn to Claire and ask for a summary of the sense of the discussion as you?
I was dread when the chairman asked me that.
I think it's the fact that we're looking for this information to be fed back by officers or from officers to a further report that would come either back to ourselves or back to full council. And I think it's appropriate that we ask officers to examine each of what this subcommittee finds to be the acceptable considerations going forward, and how we can separate out where appropriate and what difficulties or risks might lie therein. So from that point of view, I think it would be helpful for members just to get a sense of that's come from the debate, to drill it down into the specific questions that members would look for answers coming back from officers on.
I think the mood is that the policy and resources as it stands is not sustainable in terms of its bi-monthly meetings and its agenda. So I think there's a sort of mood towards perhaps reporting monthly, but having separate meetings for certain scrutiny of certain services, or there's the option to go for a completely separate Community and Customer Services Committee. I think the issue is bringing together the examples that you gave about the playing fields, etc., how it lies with one department and another department, how we bring these together so the proper scrutiny takes place at the appropriate committee. I think the feeling would be that we don't create separate committees. I just think the management of the P&R committee needs to be better handled, so that when members come to that meeting, there's very specific things that they're looking at, and we keep everything very strategic, and all the items that I currently see for noting, we need to manage that a bit better.
Thanks, Claire. It's always been in the gift of the officers to actually use their discretion where necessary to make monthly meetings happen if the business load is such that it demands it. But that hasn't happened more recently. Colin and then Ivor.
Still nobody's explained to me why a council service is in a strategic committee, and I still haven't got that. I mean, there seems to be a kind of reluctance to have a separate committee, but also why do we have a separate committee for housing? Why do we have a separate committee for education? Why do we have a separate committee for social work? You know, but community and customer services is somehow different. A sports centre is different than a school building in terms of the council structures. I've never been able to work out. It was effectively put in there because it was part of resources committee, and then when resources merged with policy committee, it just tagged along. So I've never been able to get my head around why people think that one department is somehow different in the way it's dealt with than another. I mean, I've always had the view that policy and resources should be a strategic committee, not a service committee. But you know, I suppose one option is to look at the monthly meetings and effectively 1 month as a service committee and 1 month as a strategic committee. It's not the solution I would go for, but you know, I'll bow to the majority, I suppose, and that's one way forward. I just think that you've also got the problem of you're not tackling the issue that Jane raises, apart from for one department. Jane seems to think that we go down this sort of silo approach. Well, we go down the silo approach for every other council service except for this one, and that therefore doesn't tackle the problem apart from for one particular department. And I think there's also an issue about actually targeting decisions in far too small a group of councillors. I mean, most of the people in this room are on Policy and Resources Committee. That has huge amounts of power, as well as all the strategic decisions. We've also got authority over a council department as well. And I think that, you know, I think there is an issue to be discussed about whether or not that's actually fair on other councillors that happen not to be on Policy and Resources Committee, that they don't have the same clout, frankly, and authority that we have. You know, we're effectively running two things with policy, and in fact 3 things, 2 council departments and a strategic committee as members of that particular committee. And I think there's not really a balance here in terms of member involvement. Seems to me there's no, I mean, Claire mentioned the fact that there's a feeling that we shouldn't create a separate committee I'm not sure where that feeling's coming from. It's certainly not come from the Labour group. But there is no, in my view, any additional workload between having a separate committee and having a policy and resources meeting every month. 1 month for community and customer services and 1 month for strategic issues. That's no different. The only thing that changes is the members on that committee. But there's no additional workload issues there at all. And I think, I mean, looking at policy and resources, I would have difficulty finding an item in last month's agenda that should be dropped. I think there were all important items on that agenda. There just happened to be too many of them, but that wasn't because officers were putting items on that shouldn't have been on there. It was because the remit of that committee is massive compared to other committees. And I would think it would be unfair to drop any items that were on that agenda last month. But what I do know is that when it comes to community and customer services, it gets less scrutiny than any other council department, because it's tucked in at the end of the agenda most of the time, and most people are tired by the time it gets to that stage. And also I think there are less reports from that department as well, because I think they can get away with that sometimes because it is tucked in at the end of the Policy and Resources Committee.
Well, perhaps you're looking at the same committee meeting once as a policy committee and 1 month as a resources committee.
You could do that, but it doesn't actually tackle the problem of actually putting all the decision making or giving that members that happen to be on that committee powers over two things, if you like. It doesn't. You're basically, you've already got a lot. Not everybody can be on committees. We took a decision to cut the number of members per committee, so that excluded a lot of members from participating. And by effectively giving the same members authority over effectively two committees, which is what we're doing, then you're again putting it in the hands of a small number of people. If groups decide that they wish to put the same people on policy and resources and community and customer services because of the consistency, that's entirely a matter for the group. But it doesn't seem to say we should impose that on groups.
Okay, Ivor?
Chair, I'm not against taking things out of policy and resources, putting them elsewhere, but I am concerned that by just doing it, a lot of these things that we've had in the past, we changed back to what we have just now, and I would just, say everything comes full circle. We're going back to what we were when I first started in the council, in the executive committee. We had a community resources committee, we had combined services, and I don't want to take something out and then end up thinking, well, actually, because we've done that, that means they're not going to do this because it doesn't suit them, it suits their committee to do something else. And we lose the cross-working. It's not there just now, I understand. But how do we make sure we don't go back into the silos if we do that? And that's what worries me. If we end up, if you want that, you'll have to get a paper onto community resources. If it's community resources, we go back to, and therefore something that should have been done through education, if it's playing fields, would have set that playing field part, or sport and leisure would have been better feeding in through the education committee and actually doing the business there, rather than, well, we want to do this and the other one saying, no, we want to do that. I think that's my concern. It's how we manage to get everything like a cogwheel working together rather than the two teeth coming together and stopping.
Yeah, I think that in part reflects back on what I was saying earlier, though. This subcommittee has been tasked with the job of looking at these and asking for reports to be brought back from officers to make further assessment of how it can be better taken forward, i.e. the structure, the delegation, and so on and so forth. So we're not actually here today to determine an outcome insofar as, right, this is going to be changed to such and so on and so forth. I think it's perfectly appropriate that we go to officers and say, we would like to have a report back on this change taking place and the impact that that would have and how that would interact in other decisions that we might take later on or that have already been taken or the existing status quo.
I'm sure Alex got a view as the lead officer for policy and resources as to the options that have been mooted today and how these could be taken forward. So,
Tom?
I'll just make one final point that, there's no correlation between the other issues that Policy and Resources Committee deals with and the customer services. They're two totally separate things. One is a department that's out there servicing the people, another one's a strategic department. I'd also point out that the community resources side is the third biggest budget in the council. You know, it's far bigger than PHE and S, it's far bigger than DG First, yet they've got separate committees. And, you know, rather than, because I know folk could be quite happy to serve in a committee that was dealing with these leisure functions, or something they could bring to that, there's some knowledge they've got. They're not happy sitting in a policy committee where it's more in-depth and more strategic. So that's one of the reasons why we'd like to see it separated. It allows various councillors who've got talents in different ways to participate. But the main reason being is there's absolutely no correlation between the community and customer services and the rest of what the policy committee does. They're two totally separate issues.
Those are against the separation. Can I ask why you're against separation when it comes to that particular council department, but not a separation between policy and resources and every other council department there is? Because we've kind of got a contradiction there that somehow the provision of a sports centre is different than a provision of a house, because the housing isn't dealt with by policy and resources. So why should sports centres be determined by policy and resources? The sports fields are currently looked after by education and they're determined by policy and resources, but we seem to be happy with that being done by education committee, so there's a separation there, but we seem to be unhappy that the sports fields that are run by community and customer services are separate from the policy and resources committee. I can't get my head around that argument at all. The strategic direction of the council set by policy and resources has nothing to do with the service delivery of an individual sports field. Why are we treating one department different from every other department of the council?
I assume that was a question directed at Ivor. Okay, Ivor, and then Jane.
Chair, I'm not against it going out of policy and resources. I just want to make sure where it goes is the right place. And should that be into education, because we have education sports fields, and we could link the two together, and hopefully they would work better and more in line. It's not that I'm against it going. I just want to make sure it goes to the right place, and we don't then create another division which might cause problems. And it's maybe we need the report, or maybe we need a post-it notes and put where we think it should go, and then we hear where the issues are, because we have changed things in the past. Housing was one. We've got housing sitting in social work. We've got housing sitting in PH&E. They both have, housing and social work's remit is social work, and the housing part of the strategic planning for it is in planning, housing, environment. But surely the two should tie up. And, you know, we've created these things in trying to move forward. We've actually created more issues sometimes rather than resolving them. And when we're going forward the next time, I'd rather make sure we got as near perfect as we can, rather than at the next stage, oh, we didn't think about that, and we'll have to go back and look at this again.
And I certainly agree that from the point of view of this subcommittee, I think we're here to examine the options that there are out there and get feedback and make determinations to give feedback to the full council. And we shouldn't be in a rush to jump one way or the other at this point in time. This information being sent back to CMT, for example, and something coming back from them in terms of a risk assessment carried out with a view to feedback in respect of how these remits might be better served for the outcomes that we're looking for, I think is perfectly reasonable for us to do as a subcommittee at this time. If that's coming back, Colin, on what Ivor was saying, then I'll go to Jane.
I think we're probably in agreement, and I think that the issue for us is that this department shouldn't necessarily sit within policy and resources, which should be a strategic committee, and given its workload, then that's justified. So I think that removing it from there, in my view, is the right thing to do. The question then becomes, should it be either three things, if you like, the Policy and Resources Committee meeting monthly and 1 month is on that department? I don't agree with that one, but that's one option that seems to be being punted, and it doesn't actually tackle the issue that Ivor mentions, is whether it should be in education, etc., because it's not. It's in Policy and Resources. The second option is a standalone committee, or the third option is community customer services, maybe excluding the benefit side of things, etc., but more the sport and leisure side of things and community learning development, etc., being part of education. That might be the third option, if you like, and that does open up a whole issue about should community learning development be part of education, which is quite a logical thing, and therefore should sport and leisure. I think maybe looking at those three options might be the way forward and actually analysing the pros and cons of them. My fear would be, in not having a standalone committee, my fear would be that you then transfer the problem of far too many issues from Policy and Resources to the Education Committee, which is already more than half the spend of the Council, and we're then adding another department to that. So that committee then pretty much spends 60% of what the Council spends, and that seems an awful lot to put in the hands of just 19 members. And again, it excludes further members as well, and I think that was one of the reasons why it was taken away from there in the first place, because it was education and basically sport and leisure was seen as being too much. But it seems to me there are three options there. Personally speaking, I think the option of creating a separate committee, and therefore it's consistent with every other department who has a committee, is the best way forward. I think there's an issue, a wider issue about the budgets of committees and actually aligning the individual committee budgets with the specific, the individual department budgets with the relevant committee. We've got ourselves in a right mess over social work because frankly that hasn't done appropriately, and the budget of social work hasn't been properly scrutinised over a period of time, and therefore I think having the department budget aligned with the relevant committee is one of the arguments why I'm maybe against themed committees, and therefore you have the Community and Customer Services budget aligned with that Community and Customer Services committee, and therefore you've got a direct scrutiny there, and that's one of the reasons why I'm in favour of sort of committees almost, if you like, being in line with what council departments are.
I think you were right in your opening remarks, Colin, that we're coming close if we haven't arrived at a consensus about the questions that we want to get answers from CMT with regard to on the various points that have been raised. But Jane?
Yeah, I think the argument has moved on, actually. I was really looking at the report, Chairman, with the options that we were given in the report. I recognise what's being said with respect to tightening up services and budgets, policy, business and budgets. I do recognise that, but I still think that there is room to consider what we're trying to achieve on a more thematic basis. I suppose I am saying that I would like seriously to consider thinking about option 2.
Sorry, are we happy that we're at a point here where we're seeking further information, clarification and risk assessment report coming back to us on the various options that members have discussed here this morning thus far? Is that? But with particular regard to P&R, I think it's a key one in terms of opening up to further considerations in this paper. Some of the questions that will automatically be answered as a result of what we've already covered. Ivor?
Chair, I think on the P&R one, there seems to be consensus that the level of business going through is excessive for one meeting. So I think there is a feeling that also that there are service areas in there that should be at service committees. I think there's consensus in that. And could we have a report back on how we would go about whether it's a separate committee for that or whether it's integrating into other service committees to make sure that we get the best alignment, or maybe fudging it here to the priorities, so that we can actually make sure that if we want to do anything in one area, it does cross-cut. We don't have to go to every other committee because we've actually got it in the right place to actually do it at the start. That's maybe try to be all things to all men, I don't know.
I mean, I agree, we do have reports going which has the recommendation to another committee, so it does seem to bounce around a lot, some issues, so I'm in agreement with the leader.
about budgets as well, and I think that's a point that we shouldn't lose sight of, is that the budget setting process, I've been a long critic of it because it spends all its time looking at the savings rather than what we spend the 300 million on, and there's a role of service committees to actually properly, via if they decide to make particular strategic decisions within the department, money from one budget, if you like, to another within the department, and we don't do that often enough. We haven't even, bizarrely enough, and I don't know why, we haven't even agreed the budgets for individual service committees, service departments for this year. So the financial year starting the 1st of April, and officers are off spending money, but I've never, as a member of a committee, agreed the budget for PH&E. I've never agreed, education's never agreed the education budget. There's an issue there which is separate, but I think there's an issue about actually aligning budgets, department budgets, with the relevant committee to make sure that we're actually better at deciding how we spend the money of the council, rather than just where we find the £10 million worth of savings every year. And the worry about the themes, and this is, because we discussed having theme committees and the need for closer working together, and a long debate about it. And the one thing that did move us away from that direction was the need, in our view, to align budgets with the relevant committee. And there is a danger if you go down a route of one department effectively being split in its report to several different committees, you then split who decides what that department then spends its money on between those two things. So I think that's always a danger, and I think that's a real weakness of how we spend our money at the moment, that we don't properly scrutinise individual department budgets. And I think that's an important issue that needs to be looked at. We just don't even agree, frankly, department budgets anymore.
Tom?
Yeah, just to back up what Colin's saying, I think there's councils that tried having teamed committees and they didn't work, because it actually encouraged the silo mentality. Because if you look at this council's priorities, we've got 6 priorities. It doesn't even cover potholes. So potholes will get forgotten about because it's not covered by any of the 6 council priorities in the front piece of your thing there. But to be quite honest about it, the priorities one, non-runner, because what you'd end up with if you've got a priority, a good start in life for all our children, prepare young children for adulthood and employment. Okay, you'll have folk come along for social work, folk come along for education. Well, that's my job. And the committee's not able to make the proper direction here, because the committee won't have the authority to interfere with a director's management. So, at the end of the day, as I say, it's been tried elsewhere, these theme committees. Quite a few authorities in Scotland started off that way back in '95, and they quite soon dropped it when they realised it was actually making the silo mentality a lot worse. So I don't think we should even look at certainly what our priorities are. I think we'd have to change our priorities if you wanted to have team committees and council priorities, because, as I say, our council priorities don't cover a lot of the services that we take for granted out there.
As elected members, I know that what I'm looking for is the outcomes, and if the outcomes aren't there, I'm not getting into the operational aspects. I'm looking for professional officers to tell me when I'm going to get the outcomes that I'm due and that I've been assured that I'm going to get. But okay, are we looking at 5.3 then, Education Committee? Sorry, Colin, if you're feeling...
I'm just going to laugh, and I thought the first one was going to be the quickest one, the easiest one to sort out, so we haven't even got into education yet. But we didn't have any, as a group, strong view on changing the current education. There is the issue about the overlap with social work and children's services, but we didn't have a solution to that. And I don't know if other groups had raised that as a particular issue.
Ivor?
Chair, is what's in the current education remit, I think, takes in education the issues with regard to CLD, and that's maybe something that we need to bring back. The only thing is Colin's point on the children's services against adult services. We have the integration coming up. It may be that once we've got integration of the health and social care, maybe that's the time to revisit this one to see if there's anything that needs to be moved for children's services into here.
I think as part of the governance that will come alongside integration, that will be a natural progression of that process, and therefore reports will come back to us as a result of that. Jane?
Yeah, that's absolutely fine. I was going to make the same point. I think that the early years agenda is so important, and that's to do with health. So, yes, with that integration of health and social care, I think that's something which we really have to reconsider.
Okay, thank you. Are we happy on the 5.3 then, at this point in time? 5.4, the PH&E Service Committee. Again, Colin?
I mean, I think we had several kind of issues around this one. The first one was on planning policy. We thought that planning policy would be best, instead of having a planning applications committee, we should have a planning committee, and it determined planning policy as well as obviously the individual planning applications. The sort of background to that was the fact that I think most members felt that certainly sitting on PH&E and then being on an area planning committee, I got a better grasp of planning policy and what might need to be changed and what might not need to be changed by sitting actually determining planning applications. And effectively you've kind of removed that, so the people that have got the expertise and the knowledge as to how the planning policy is actually working in practical terms don't necessarily sit on the committee that determine the policy. And I think that actually having the planning applications committee simply being a planning committee determining policy and obviously determining planning applications was a logical way forward. And we were keen that we look at actually, I suppose, the title, if you like, and the focus of the PH&E committee. It would then, if you did remove planning, it would be called the Housing and Environment Services Committee, which in my view doesn't reflect what the majority of the work of that committee actually is. And it's banded around titles, but regeneration is a significant, in the economy, is a significant priority of this council, but it isn't actually mentioned in the title of that particular committee. It would be called Housing and Environment Services. So it would be everything else other than the things that are the highest priority, if you like, for that department. So actually having a regeneration committee might be a more appropriate phrase, because we've got a separate housing committee anyway. But I think taking planning out of there, planning policy out of there, was certainly a view that the Labour group had.
Thank you. Tom?
Yeah, I mean, there's still some folk nostalgic for returning planning back to area committees, but I think across the council that's probably a no-no. But it's historical that the PHE&S committee had the overview of planning, because if area committees went against policy, it had to go up to the planning committee for whatever. Now, when this council did away with the area committees handling planning, they never took that remit away from PHE&S committee. And I find it a bit ludicrous that I'm sitting there in the planning committee having to carry out policies, which the wind farm policies, for example, or interim wind farm policy, the members of the planning committee had no say in that, yet we're expected to implement it. It's only committee of the council where members are carrying out policy but don't determine it. Every other committee of the council, they determine their policies and they carry them out. The area that worried me again was the local development plan. We had input at the full council, but in terms of developing that local development plan, that was mainly done by PHE&S committee and not the actual planning committee. And bearing in mind that to be in the planning committee and serve in the local review body, you must undergo training. We've got folks sitting in the PHE&S committee making planning policy who have not undergone that training. And I think that's totally unfair. And I really believe that we should get in line with every other committee and have the planning policy determined by a planning committee. As Colin says, you can take the planning and housing out of that existing committee and perhaps call it the economic and environment committee, more in line with the role it's carrying out. Because housing is a very small part of that. Right? It still gives folk the impression that this is a housing authority, when we're really not. We've got a strategic role and that's it.
Thank you. Jane, Ivor, sorry.
This is one, I don't know how to resolve it, because surely planning and development planning should drive your economic regeneration as well. It's part and parcel. You know, should we have this as a business area or should be a housing area? Will that bring in a better economic regeneration? So if you've got economic regeneration, you need to have input. However, on the other side, if you take councillors who came in after the local plans were adopted and after the strategic plan was adopted, they didn't have ownership of it. So why are we doing that? Because somebody back in 98, decided that this was the plan. One of the first things I did in the old E&I committee was agree a strategic plan that had no input into it. Because, well, you have to do this. This is how it was set up. This is the work that we've done. So I've got a plan there that I've learned to accept and understand why it's there, but it needs to be changed. People buying into it this time. So I find this an awkward one to do. Should planning go to planning apps committee and become planning committee? Yes, but then how does it tie into the economic regeneration part? Because they do go hand in hand. I think one of the ones was the environmental health services, and that was talk about going to the new public protection committee. Well, if that's where it needs to go, and that's the most appropriate place. It was there before. We took it out because we felt it suited better in here because some of the environmental health and environmental standards tied in with regulation things, and I think that's why it was moved there. If it needs to go back to a public protection committee, I'm happy to consider that. But it's how we get the tie-up between our planning, which is could be one committee, and our economic regeneration committee, which might take a different view as to how to best do it. That's one of the issues I have, but I'm willing to be convinced on how to take that one forward.
Sorry, with having it lie with the area committees isn't helpful in terms of the overview of the region and how investors, developers would view the position overall of investing in Dumfries and Galloway if we didn't have a single policy that we could give assurance to investors, developers in the future coming to this area, that they wouldn't have to jump through various hoops depending on what part of the geography of the region they were dealing with. But again, I'm perfectly happy at the prospect of a greater drive being put behind economic development, not least, and that being highlighted as something that we as a council need to see driven far more effectively in the future. I don't have any difficulty setting planning aside from the rest of the practices or the other practices of the PH&E at the present time. I do take the point insofar as housing sub is concerned that not being an authority with a housing stock, however, having the statutory responsibility as the housing authority in the region, it's not an overworked department in that regard, but it's at the same time been an extremely successful department in attracting a level of investment in housing in more recent years that is pretty unsurpassed, and I would hope that would continue. So I would hope to be able to drive housing in the future in the same effective manner as it's been driven in more recent times. So members really are asking for a report back. Is this Tom?
Yeah, I mean, I think the other thing we would agree with is the environmental health and the trading standards. If they were given a new public protection committee, because they did lie there before. And I think there are two services that serve a very important function. And we saw that during the horse meat scandal. There was not one report came to our committee, because basically the director and the chief officers there are so remote for them two services that, I can't remember the last time I ever saw a report coming forward. And when I think back at one time, the district councils all had environmental health committees, the regional council had trade and standards committee. Members were actually aware of which hotels and restaurants were getting bad marks. You knew where to go and eat and where not to eat because you were getting reports. And these reports were in public, which was a damn good thing for the public as well. You also knew the guys that were serving dodgy measures in pubs, etc. And that became public knowledge. Nowadays, the guys are still doing that work, but elected members know nothing of that, neither do the public. It's high time these things were back out in the public domain. I'd like to know where the best places are that are keeping clean kitchens, where I'm not going to get a short measure for my whiskey or whatever. So I think we need to give them a greater prominence. I think Ivor's got a wee point about the policy side, but I think if the planning committee dealt with the planning policy, there's obviously a need for the economic and environment committee to feed into that. And there's no harm with them saying, right, we wish to make this submission. I mean, from my point of view as a member of the planning committee, the economic one is not the one I get too worried about. It's some of the more local stuff to do with the particularly the wind farm policy. That one really annoyed me, because when you've been sitting in that committee, you're well aware of where the pressures are, and particularly with the public, but where they're feeling particularly grieved about that. Whereas the folks sitting in PHE&S committee, they're not aware of the pressures there, and they're quite happy to pass this interim planning policy that we had. So I think it's vital that those folk who are directly involved in planning have got a major say in how the policy is evolved. But I think there should be the other committees should feed into that, particularly for the economic and housing aspects. They should definitely have a say.
Well, correct me if I'm wrong, but I thought actually, I didn't think it was 19 people who decided the interim planning policy on wind farm. I seem to remember it came to full council. And in actual fact, we change planning policy once in a blue moon, statutorily. We change it once in a blue moon. Tom's absolutely right about training, though. I think actually that all members should endure planning training. I think that's absolutely right. I think they should, so that they understand. But, I don't think that sits easily, actually, taking planning policy to the planning committee. I don't think that would be actually necessary or particularly proportionate, because we get a chance to deal with it through full council. And that's correct. We absolutely should. Somebody talked about, yes, Tom talked about environmental health. I am totally with him. That should be reported to the area committees. It's a customer service. That's where it should be reported. We want to know locally.
Thanks, Jane. I think, if nothing else, a strong point that's coming out is that any member who has been asked a question to make a decision or determination on any planning matter, it should be assured that that person has been subjected to the form of training appropriate to that decision-making process. So that maybe that's something that we need to bracket in there as part of the process. Ivor and Colin.
Chair, I think it gets down to the fact of the earlier discussion. How do we make sure we get the cross-service working? Because I think there is a role within strategic housing for some of the housing operations to feed into planning. Likewise, the social work services responsibilities need to be able to feed into the strategic housing. So it's how we manage whatever the committee is to actually make sure that the department does the job. Now, it may mean that some departments report to two committees, but in different roles. And I think we need to work out how we can manage that so that the work does get done in the appropriate place. Because, like I say, if you've got 19 members around a committee table that weren't involved in planning policy, they might not agree with it, and you'll find that you get decisions that aren't with. Yeah. And I think there is a case we need to make sure that everything does tie in. It seems to be the backroom working, how you make those work. Then where it reports to, it could be the planning committee or it could be the economic regeneration one, depends on which it is. So I think that's an issue that CMT needs to kick about and see how they can make sure that the services do link together. So we don't have, well, actually a decision was taken here, so therefore this service says we're not listening to what that service said because our parent committee said whatever.
So basically the question for CMT is, how can you give us assurance that all of these reports are going to be meaningful and stand up to scrutiny in terms of what's put before the elected member? Colin?
Entirely what's been said, we're getting caught up in when we suggest making a change to a committee that somehow that's going to be a disaster when it comes to cross-working. But actually we have separate committees at the moment, so if it's going to be a disaster, then we've already got that disaster, unless you put absolutely everything to full council. and then you have cross-working. So we have to bear in mind that the committee structure isn't necessarily the solution to cross-working. And in terms of planning, it's not just about the local development plan, for example, because that's agreed by full council anyway. It's about all the other things that come up, and as a member of PH&E, there is always a planning item at some description at each meeting. It can very often be a consultation from the Scottish Government on national policy, and I'm asked to feed into that, having never made a determination on a planning application for about 3 years now. I'm asked to feed into a consultation on planning policy with the Scottish Government. I'm also asked to scrutinise the planning department at PH&E because that's part of the remit of PH&E, but I don't actually sit in the planning applications committee, so I have no idea about what actually happens when it comes to planning applications, but I'm scrutinising that department. So the planning policy is part of it, but the big planning policy issues all go to the development plan, for example, all goes to full council anyway. It's about all the other scrutiny role of the planning department, and I think that sits far better within a planning committee than it does within PH&E when we're not actually doing the day-to-day work on planning applications. I think it makes sense to give it to the planning committee.
Okay, are there any other points that members would like to raise? You want to say anything?
No.
Yes, and it ain't finished yet for CMT. 5.5 Social Work Services Committee. Any comments, Ivor?
Is this another one that act as is until we see what's going to happen with integration so that we can determine better what needs to be addressed then?
Yeah, thank you. Jane?
I totally agree. Let's not rush into doing anything specific with this one. Let's get this one right with respect to our outcomes and cross-cutting with health. I'm absolutely with you on that.
Okay, thank you. You happy to move on at that then?
One of the things that does concern me is just the whole sort of accountability issue, and I'm sure that'll be dealt with when it comes to the whole combining health and social work. But how we actually spend the council's social work money is a big issue for this council at the moment, and how you then scrutinise a situation where you effectively combine the two is a real issue. The whole accountability problem is a real issue that I think needs to be addressed when it comes to whatever new structure we put in place there.
I think it will be doubly complicated by virtue of the fact that it will be part of the integration, so that will be an additional aspect of those considerations, but that will all be part of the package that we'll get back before us. Okay, thank you.
Chairman, just the only thing is the oversight of the Children's Panel Advisory Committee. Obviously, that's children's hearing systems changed, and we don't have a CPC as it stands at the moment, so that would need to be changed.
And are we going to get something put before us then, indicating what what the nature of that change would be that we can?
Yes, Chairman.
When might that be?
Not detailed knowledge of it, but I think is it June? I'll bow to my colleague on the. Is it around about June that the CPCs will cease to exist? Yep.
So that'll be brought back before this subcommittee at that time. Yeah, Jane.
Could I possibly highlight the issue about 553, Chairman, which is that we are supposed to act in the capacity of corporate parenting role of the Council in respect of children in care. I've always found this being laid upon us, and then the difficulty of some of us not being on the Social Work Services Committee, and this is about individuals. And I think that is something actually where it is laid upon, a responsibility is laid upon us in a way for individuals. I think that is, again, a more local issue. I think we've got to consider the role of area committees in that real local oversight. I don't mean in terms of individual people at all. I mean so that members, there is a direct link. At the moment, I'm sorry, there is not a direct link in terms of corporate parenting. I have no real fundamental understanding or knowledge of the requirements in my area. I just don't. We're not allowed to know because social work don't actually wish us to know.
Yeah, I think there's also a parallel argument here with the previous discussion that we had in respect of planning, that we put these matters are put before us to make determinations about when other members have been trained and have direct experience at a hands-on level, if you like, in this regard, and possibly if we aren't trained and have the knowledge that supports any decision-making process that's been put upon us, maybe we shouldn't be there. Ivor?
Chair, with relation to that one, I think Jane's got a point. You know, the council has a role as a corporate parent, and I don't know if this is the right place or whether it should be a council oversight, but we've got the early years collaborative coming on board, which is moving it towards -9 months to, you know, starting at conception and moving forward for the child and the parent and whatever. It's behave yourself. And it's maybe more of a corporate issue along with education and social work, that this should be a joint sort of issue for this one especially.
So really what we're saying is that we want feedback from CMT with regard what the new setup impacts are liable to be and how this council best address those. Yeah. Item 5.7, Scrutiny and Performance Committee. Tom?
I think the main thing in that one, I think if you take that one along with the 5.8, I'd like to see the two of them merged into one committee. They're the two committees it's the hardest to get members to serve on. You've got to have a certain resilience. Having served on both of them, having been chairman of the Scrutiny Committee at one point. But I don't really think they're... If you're going to create committees that folk want to serve on, like a community, you know, like Community Services Committee we talked about earlier on, then something's got to give. And I see no reason why these two committees, Scrutiny Committee and the Audit Committee, merge them. They can meet every month. 1 month they can do the scrutiny part, another month they can do the audit part. Because as I say, they are the two committees it's very, very difficult to get folk to serve on. And you just need to look at the attendance at these committees at times that you never get a full turnout. I think a lot of members find them dry as dust.
We used to have a Governance and Audit Committee before, I recall, I think. No.
Guys, in the audit of base value by having the two combined, was that not an issue? Yeah. Sure, that was one of the things that came out there.
But that's what I was going to suggest. Meet as an audit committee 1 month, the scrutiny committee the other month. Because the skills required for both committees are almost identical in any case.
Thanks, Tom. Claire, were you finished?
Yeah, I think, you know, the agenda for the audit and risk is quite set. It reports from internal audit, external audit, scrutiny. Tends to have kind of light agendas but kind of meaty subjects. So again, I'll go back to the CMT and see what the view is from respective reporting officers.
Ivor?
Chair, it's just when you look through the delegations for scrutiny and performance, a lot of it is you will look at this, you will look at that, whereas we're asked to actually come up with our own recommendations to what to take forward. Because one that I would find uncomfortable to do, but I think should be done, is to review the performance of the Policy and Resources Committee and Strategic and other committees, whereas we actually get down rather into whether the committee's making good decisions and the policies that we're making are being enacted. We get into, you know, the ones that are coming up issues that, as a corporate policy committee, we should be doing to scrutinise. It seems like double working, whereby, you know, the scrutiny role of you as a member of the Policy and Resources is to look at, do we equip our staff through training, etc. And one of the things we're looking at just now is, do we equip our staff through training, etc.? Now, what it should be is the policy committee adequately addressing the issue of that, rather than what is it actually doing? You know, it should be more on how the performance is. And some of the things in here I don't think actually get picked up in the scrutiny role. I think we've got an idea that we want to look at certain areas rather than following the delegations, and those are the ones that we should be looking to make sure that council's performance is right in.
I just want to make a general comment that the remits tend to vary between each committee, and others are really far more woolly than they need to be. They were devised in consultation with officers, so there's obviously differences in the style. So I think that's something that needs to be addressed as well. Some of them are very subjective. How on earth do you turn that into a report, you know? So I think that definitely needs a look at, tighten everything up. So some delegations are like a page and a half, and others are 2 lines, basically.
I think if you go to 573 there, Brian, that to hold the Policy and Resources Committee and corporate committees to account for developing and implementing policy. Well, how do you really do that at the end of the day? Because effectively what you're saying is, we don't think you've done this, we think you should be doing such and such, right? We think the policy should be... so you're getting into the realms of another committee rather than actually scrutinising what that committee's doing. You're actually saying, you know, that is a policy you should have. And that's why essentially, the two committees should be merged, and you can have an audit function 1 month if necessary and a scrutiny function the other month. I mean, Alistair Gerris is developing things on the scrutiny committee. I think there's a meeting next, or a training session next week.
Thank you. Jane?
I think scrutiny has always been actually very, very successfully non-partisan. And I mean, I wonder whether there is a delegation to the Scrutiny and Performance Committee which should both link upwards and downwards. I mean, the bit that I came across, and I think probably is my contribution, I'm sure it's others as well, is respect of the second last bullet point on page 9, which is to do with business transacted at partnership meetings, is not, you know, it isn't properly merged, and we don't get I think properly, yes, a proper overview of what happens and why. I mean, so I would suggest that there's an opportunity for members of that committee to consider whether there are proper linkages being made and whether in actual fact enough members know what's going on, and that might be a vehicle for being sure that the correct connections are made between single outcome agreement, the strategic partnerships work, and what is happening then into the council. I wonder whether we might consider that as a possibility.
I think that's always been a dilemma for members in terms of making those connections and identifying those, or whether they exist or not. But I've got sort of flashes of Kevin Garrity flying across before my eyes here as well, after watching the committee the other day and hearing some of the things that Kevin was saying in that committee. And I just wonder if his input might not be helpful in this instance. Ivor?
I'm quite happy for that to be looked at.
Thought you'd indicated.
No.
Questions to go back from this discussion on that 5.7 and 5.8, Claire?
Just looking at
Just some came to mind there actually in 585. To set key performance indicators and targets to be monitored by area committees. I think you'll recall, Ivor, that the Scrutiny Committee, we just spent a great deal of time on that very issue, and we're actually going to visit other authorities. So the Scrutiny Committee is actually undertaking some of the stuff that should be getting done by the Audit and Risk Management Committee. You're getting people, they are working across purposes at the moment.
Because 578's got the same remit.
All the service committees have that in there to monitor on their own. So you're looking at possible merging of the S&P and A&R committees on a monthly basis, and also how best we can scrutinise outcomes from partnership meetings and how they can fit back so members can be assured they've got best scrutiny of those outcomes.
And see where the links are
Yep.
insofar as the SOA is concerned. Okay, members happy that we've covered 5.8 at the same time as 5.7 there. We move on to 5.9, DG First Management Committee. Tom?
I think that's another one we question whether that's a committee that's worth keeping, to be quite frank with you. But again, that would depend on what we did when we come to look at the delegations to departments, if you like. Because I really feel that the committee's not actually making any decisions, because decisions have been made by other committees. You know, that's the money that DG First has got to spend on roads, that's the money it's got to spend on meals, that's the money it's got to spend on services for old folk. So they're only really watching the budget there, and there's probably no reason to have a separate committee. And you know, the whole of that department could be transferred into the Economic and Environment Committee under the same management, quite frank, and under the same committee. The management side is a different issue, that might be something we'll have to look at, but I think the remit of that committee could be transferred straight to Economic and Environment.
I think I see where Tom's coming from. So in terms of budget watching, which is absolutely crucial, with respect to DG First, we found in the past, although I think probably things have changed. So you would ask the commissioning department to make certain that the budgets were being adhered to. Okay. And would you then ask those on the ground, the pothole watchers, in other words, people who really know what's going on, and communities feeling whether they're getting a good service or not, through the area side of things? I mean, I'm just feeling my way through. I'm asking a question. I'm not being.
Well, I think as previously discussed in a number of counts, that there are changes actually taking place as we speak. There are the resources that are going out to the area committees in terms of returning, at least to some extent, or area management, sorry, in terms at least to some extent of bringing back the old regime of inspections on the roads. But there are also changes afoot insofar as care delivery is concerned. That is a responsibility that currently falls under DG First. And so there are a number of practices that are taking place. To my mind, in all honesty, insofar as the commission and delivery role is concerned, DG First seems to be a counter. To me, it's simply somewhere that PH&E goes and asks for a certain job of work to be carried out. And then we're looking for the same scrutiny from PH&E that request has been fulfilled, and the DG First Committee is looking for that scrutiny, that the work that they've had given them has been carried out to the customer satisfaction or to the satisfaction of the board of DG First. So I think there's a number of changes that are changing the focus insofar as this committee is concerned, and the remit. So I would be interested to see what the long-term need for a board actually is, and whether this shouldn't fall under regeneration, economic development, whatever the old PH&E, essentially. Tom?
Yeah, I think you've got to remember how this came about. Again, it's historical. It's because the government 30 years ago decided that certain services, the council should go out to competitive tendering. So roads maintenance went out to competitive tendering, school meals went out to competitive tendering, the care for the elder went out to competitive tendering. And essentially I had at one time the education department, it put the school meals out to competitive tendering, it won everything in-house and it ran it again. And then as things evolved and the 5 councils in the area came together, they put all these things into one department. And one of the things that was supposed to get out of that was a mobility of labour, if you like, that you should have had, because there were a lot of part-time jobs there, particularly for women, there was opportunity there to merge some of the jobs in schools with some of the jobs in the community. So the thinking behind it was that if you, some of the more rural areas, that somebody could actually have been a carer for somebody in the morning, gone in and done the school meals at lunchtime, been a carer for somebody else in the afternoon. And that was creating economic mobility within, not so much in the urban areas, but certainly the rural areas. But that doesn't seem to have worked. And this client-contractor split, I think there's economies to be made there in the management of how it's managed. So to have a separate committee, I think the answer would be no. I think we come to look at the departments, that's for another day, quite frankly.
So what are the specific questions that we're asking under this DG First Management Committee delegation? Sorry?
Should it exist?
Thank you.
I mean, there is an issue over, certainly sitting on PH&E that I've got, whereby I don't feel that I'm scrutinising what PH&E is actually commissioned appropriately, because actually it's another committee that deliver it that seem to do that scrutiny. And we as a PH&E committee commission something, but we don't seem to have any sort of remit in actually finding out whether it's been delivered. That seems to land on the actual person that's delivering it, which always seemed a bit bizarre to me. So I think that's a real issue for us.
Item 5.10, area committees. No one get any questions about that? Eh? Put them into DG first.
Nobody's satisfied with area committees at the moment, to be perfectly honest. My view, there's a mix and match there. So, and part of it was budget decisions recently. We're kind of now partly responsible for burial grounds, but another department's partly responsible for them as well. I think we've got ourselves a bit of a mess and a bit of a mix and match at the moment. I think, frankly, there is more time spent debating how you allocate £250 than we debate allocating 100-odd million at education sometimes, to be perfectly honest. I don't think anybody's satisfied with the area committee's function at the moment. What is their role? They kind of exist because they've always existed, and nobody really knows why. So I think we have to define better what their role should actually be.
So the question that this subcommittee is requesting from CMT is clarity around the future role and remit of area committees. Tom?
I think you've got remits there, but it's whether the remits are actually being carried out. That's the problem I've got since I came back onto the council. I mean, when you took the planning function away, you took the non-liquor licensing away. Now, those two things alone could justify that committee meeting one whole day a month, particularly in this deal's case. You'd be sitting here from 10 in the morning until 4 in the afternoon dealing with them things on an area basis, which, frankly, I saw nothing wrong with that, and I'd go back to that if I had my way, because at least we were getting a consistent approach. But the evening thing seems to have gone by the by. I mean, I've only been back on since 2011, but in the last 2 years, I mean, it does say they're supposed to have themed meetings. Now, I think Stewartby, I've been to 3 meetings in the Stewartby in 2 years. I've been to 4 meetings in this deal, and 2 of them were about the same thing, and one of them was actually called by the elected members rather than officers. So whether it's the fact that officers at an area level aren't bothering their backside about carrying out the remit that's given, because the remit's pretty broad, but it's the fact that it's not been carried out. And I don't think it's the fault of the elected members unless it's the area chairs. Maybe they should be taking a cudgel to the officers in the area a bit more, but I think you've got a remit there, but it's not been carried out. That's the big problem.
If you look at the remit, it says the monitor of major local projects. Now, I'm speaking on behalf of this deal, but we've got an action plan for the regeneration of Dumfries Town Centre. We've got a major project when it comes to the future of archives in the town. None of these things have ever came anywhere near area committees. in the last 2 years. So, when it comes to major, it seems to me if you're going to have area committees, they are a good basis for proper consultation with members that are actually representing the real locality where some of these projects are taking place. But I'm sure it's the same. In other area committees, I don't know how often Wig's Area Committee gets some stuff on Sunra regeneration. Or, I think these are major projects that are taking place. The Learning Town's another example. It only came to Area Committee, the Steel Area Committee, because we asked for it. But that's a major project that should be going to area committees on a regular basis and to get input from the ward members on the ground. And it is contained within the remit, but I think, as Tom says, these remits are not being followed. The agendas at area committees are becoming, frankly, a bit of a joke.
Jane?
I think the area committees remain an unexploited opportunity. I really do. I think we should focus on the fact that in our business plans for community and customer services, we are expecting an area profile to be done by March 2013. Now, the Stewardship area profile was completed some time ago, in fact, but we haven't really used them, which is what we should have been doing. We should have been looking at inequities and inequalities in our own areas, because that's what members actually really buy into. They understand their own communities, and that's what we should be really focusing on. So I don't know about the delegations here. I don't know whether they're sufficient or not. Brutal fact is I'm really not terribly interested in it. I suppose I've got to be, but I'm not. But I know what I want to try and achieve, which is that we understand locally what's happening and we want to get better outcomes for people in our areas. I think we've got to think more about devolved budgets. I think we've got to make certain that the public pound is working properly in the areas and that we draw things together by looking at whether we're getting best value on an area basis. Now, how you achieve that, I think I would challenge officers to say, come up with a scheme of delegations that gives us the tools to do that.
Forward what we've already got on paper. Yeah. Okay. 511, the LRB. Tom?
The only thing I've got with the LRB is the membership, and I'm not quite sure whether is it planning officers who choose the folk to be in the LRB, or is that handled through corporate services?
It's the planning officers, I think, whoever's available, basically.
See, I can't
rotational basis.
I can't mind whether it's the LRB or the licensing forum, where they try not to have local members involved. Is that the licensing forum?
That's the LRB. I think they try and keep local members out of the LRB.
I was asked to sit on something that was local.
See, this problem I've got, because it doesn't say anything in here, because when I came back on, I've been involved in LRBs before, and then there was one in my area where folk were coming to me saying, give them the usual answer, well, look, I sit in the plan committee, I can't say one way or another. And then I found I wasn't sitting in the LRB. But that doesn't say anything about that in the delegation here. So it's really to have a look at this, whether, who decides who sits on the LRB. I don't really think it should be a planning officer that picks because we can some elected members can be tamer than others when it comes to officers' recommendations. And officers no doubt know that themselves. So
I don't think I think it's natural selection rather than.
There's a governance issue there.
Yeah, I know they phone round and see who's available, because it's usually a 5-man committee. But I think that perhaps that needs to be looked at in the delegation, that it shouldn't be done by planning officers. It should perhaps be done at the centre by the folk who make up the diary. There is an LRB for that Wednesday. We need 5 members. And if they do it on a rotational basis, the same as the licensing forum, that way it gets spread around. And I don't see why local members should be not allowed, because I think there was the one about the supermarket in Dumfries, which I think local members were more in tune with what was happening than folk having to travel all the way for the Wigton end. So I think the way that operates and how it's delegated, I think that needs to be looked at basically.
Jane?
Well, just speaking from experience, I know that I was called to sit on an LRB which was dealing with something in my ward. So I know that I didn't actually sit on it because I couldn't, but I know that I have been asked to in the past. I thought they were done on a rotational basis. I must admit, I thought it was done that. But I agree with Tom. I think it ought to be clear.
Thank you.
Chair, I think recalling why they decided to look elsewhere for members was if you had an interest, you could actually end up with the committee being in quorum. If there was 3 members who actually had some interest in it, they might all declare an interest and then the meeting couldn't be held. I think that was the reasoning behind it. It was more to cover that. But I think the idea of having a rotational system for this and the licensing forum would be good, whereby all members are asked to participate at least so many times a year.
I think there's a training issue as well that, you know, that the same members maybe are available for some of these panels, LRBs, and others are not getting the proper practice. Yeah, but it's training and then ongoing training, isn't it?
Colin?
I'm going to say there is a governance issue there if planning officers are determining the membership. If you know, you say it's natural selection, but if you need 5 members and 7 people put their name forward, who decides the 5 out of the 7? And if it's a planning officer, then that opens up to all sorts of issues, I suppose, in questioning. And like Tom said, the one in the supermarket was 5 members, none of which actually covered this deal, for a member right, which is a bit of an issue.
Okay, thank you. Over now to 5.12, Planning Applications Committee.
If you take into consideration the points we made earlier under the PHE committee, I think that would cover this one.
5.13, Civic Government Licensing Panel. Tom?
I mean, I appreciate how that came about because they wanted to move it away from the area committees. So it felt one area committee in particular wasn't maybe dealing with it properly, but never mind. But I don't think it's the ideal way to deal with a lot of this stuff because you're not getting the consistency there. At least you've got a level of consistency, area committee level, that, well, 3 to 4 area committees anyway, you were getting a level of consistency of how taxi drivers were dealt with and how other people were dealt with. You're not getting that with this licensing panel because it's different people every time. And you can get similar type cases. In fact, there was one case which started with one licensing panel, which I served on. When it resumed again, it was different folk, except two had been on the original panel and 2 were in the second panel, which was kind of stupid because we'd heard half the evidence at one and we were at the next one. So it's not very well done. I think that is one that should go back. Maybe if it doesn't have to go to the area committee, I think you've already got licensing boards in place in the 4 areas. And you could just call the licensing boards licensing panels for non-liquor licensing applications. Now, I know 1 or 2 of them are a wee bit short in membership. You could open up the membership for another couple of members, particularly in Wigton and Stewartry areas. I think the Nistio one of 9 members is big enough for dealing with that kind of thing. I think Stewartry's 5, it could probably go up to 7. Wigton's 5, it could maybe go to 7. But I think if that was handed over to the licensing boards, and then when they meet for non-liquor licensing, designated as licensing panels, and they deal with things in their area. I think that would be a fairer way of proceeding than we are at the moment, because I don't think this is a very fair way of handling it at the moment.
Any other views? No. Okay. Item 6, standing orders, standing subcommittees, sorry. Council's established standing subcommittees comprising 11 members. Subcommittees are based on proportionality. So the employment appeals sub. Tom?
I think two things I'd look at here is A, whether you keep that committee at all. I think since the Policy and Resources Committee has got oversight of the personnel issues, perhaps it would sit better there. You know, all the employment appeals thing being dealt with by a policy committee. The alternative to that is, at the moment, that's an 11-member committee, but it's also got 11 substitutes, which I find a bit weird. And quite often substitutes are never used. In fact, the last time that committee met as an employment committee was the appointment of Steve Herriot, I think. And there was only 5 members actually made the appointment. 7 members out of 11 turned up because they didn't send subs. 2 couldn't make the appointment because they hadn't received the appropriate training. So effectively, 5 elected members appointed a senior officer. And I don't think that's good. As I say, my alternative would be to transfer it to the Policy and Resources Committee. Or the other alternative is, make that one a 19-man committee for the purposes of appointments. Because I think if somebody's going to get appointed to a major position, then they should be able to see that massive sea of faces in front of them, because that's what they're going to have to deal with when they attend a committee. And I see nothing wrong with having a full 19-man committee making appointments. Obviously, when it comes to appeals and disciplinary matters, that is far too unwieldy. And I think that, and again, an 11-man committee dealing with discipline is also, it's not the right way to proceed. I think if people went to an industrial tribunal, if you were dealing with one person coming in on an appeal who's not a member of a trade union, didn't bring a friend with them, it's pretty overpowering to have 11 elected members sitting there and half a dozen officers of one kind or another. So I think for an appeals process, should be no more than 7 members dealing with appeals. So there are two ways of looking at it. Either make it a 19-man committee, and it only meets as a 19-man committee for the purposes of appointments, and at all other times, if it's just dealing with appeals, then it's per many 7 from 19. My preferred thing would be just transfer it on to the Policy and Resources Committee, because for all the time it meets over a year in any case. We've got one appointment coming up very shortly, and I think the last couple of years have been 2 appeals and 1 appointment. So it'd fit in very well with the Policy and Resources Committee and save the need for a separate committee. Failing that, I would certainly go for a full 19-man committee for appointments and 7-member appeals subcommittees.
Thank you. Jane?
I think Tom thinks being appointed is a bit like being a Christian appearing at the Colosseum. I don't feel very strongly about this, to be honest. At the moment, it's taken a bit of time to get it up and running. It's at last up and running. We at last have everybody there. Do we need to change it? Would be my question. But I'm not going to die in a ditch over it.
Ivor?
Chair, I think we need one. I think it is a separate committee whereby it can be seen to be separate. But I think Tom's point about looking at the numbers who actually sit on the committee might be something worth exploring.
Do you have a view on numbers in that regard? I mean, Tom's talking 19 for appointments, for example, and 7 for appeals. And
that's something I'm willing to accept. You know, I think the idea of having 19 in an appeal would be very daunting for anyone, because it's not a nice thing to go through. Fair enough, an appointment isn't a nice thing to go through either, but you do need to have some people who can, as Tom says, and Jane says, be the Christian in the Colosseum and take the line on. Yeah.
what about the prospect of putting this under P&R?
I certainly when they put the appeals to P&R in terms of the numbers, I think a committee of 19 dealing with an appeal, I don't think is right. So I certainly wouldn't do that. Whether you then have a committee, seven. But if you had, but you would have to be 7 for. I mean, why don't you know? If you did decide to put it to P&R, you might have a separate employment appeals subcommittee of 7 people, and that would be a separate committee. And then your appointments would be P&R, and that would deal with all the other employment stuff. That might be one option if you did decide to put it to P&R. But this is a big debate about removing things from P&R, I suppose. And although it doesn't seem to be that onerous based on the number of appointments. But I definitely wouldn't go ahead with. I think a subcommittee of 7 people for employment appeals is a sensible idea.
We'd look forward to feedback from CMT on that one in particular, and the different numbers. Okay, 2.1.2 pension sub. Any? Ivor?
Chair, I think this is a very specialist kind of subject, and I think we need to have a group there that can actually maintain the sort of training that they require. So I think we should maintain this as a subcommittee.
They're now officially banned.
Okay, thanks. 6.1.3, Crichton Subcommittee.
I think it's only met on one occasion that I can recall. So.
Okay, 6.2, Housing Sub. We've really covered it.
Change the name to Strategic Housing Subcommittee, I think, but I think it does a good job at the moment.
Okay, thank you. 6.4, Social Work Services Committee. The sub, sorry.
Is that not work in progress?
Again, yeah. Yeah, does anyone have any comments from 6.5 really onward? Area committees to establish subcommittees for discharge of functions relating to common good funds, trusts and other local issues. As far as delegations are concerned, does any member have any suggestions in those regards that can be noted?
I just query the membership of certain of the common good fund subcommittees, especially in Stewardship, just a membership of 3, in terms of any declarations of interest that make the meeting in quora. That's certainly an issue. I don't know if any mood to up the numbers to 5, or in fact then that's practically the whole committee, isn't it? But it is an issue I've noticed from the minutes coming forward.
Tom?
I think it was an issue that arose at Stewardship, and if I recall correctly, it was at Kirkcudbright, because the 3 members for the Kirkcudbright ward had also been appointed to some other body in Kirkcudbright. But if they'd gone as observers, they were fine, but the fact they were actually committee members meant they couldn't make the decision, so it had to come back to the Stewardship Area Committee. But I mean, I would leave the area committee, I would leave the common good funds the way they because they are a creature of the council. They were delegated to the area committees to decide. The area committees have all made a decision how they'll be done. I mean, the one in Sankar, for instance, there's no elected members sitting that. What they decided in that area was that they'd refer it to the local community council, which was very representative of the Sankar area, and any recommendations they made, that would come to the area committee, and it would be endorsed. The Dumfries one was set up a different way, but I think the way Annan, Kirkcudbright and the rest have all been set up, it's 3 members in that particular area. And if it needs to go back to the area committee for a decision, I see nothing wrong with that, actually.
Jane?
No, I think that's absolutely right. The Kirkcudbright one was a one-off. In actual fact, it's been sorted, that particular issue now. Gatehouse is the same as Sankar. It's delegated to the Community Council, and then it comes for ratification to the area committee, and I wouldn't mess around with it. I think it's fine.
Thank you. Any comments on item 7, number of meetings? Item 8, place and time of meetings. Ivor?
Chair, it's just with the place and time of meetings. I think if you like the employment appeals, I think you should be looking to have it in a room that is conducive to that size of committee. I think coming in here, if you're having an employment appeals, it would be daunting to the appellant. But if you were in a smaller room that sort of suited that arena, that's the sort of thing I've liked to thought consideration would be given to. I know that causes an issue if there's recording or anything to happen, but
Recording's at the discretion of the chairman. So. The non-confidential part of the employment and appeals, which is actually just the Sederunt and apologies, basically.
Colin?
Because obviously even confidential items are recorded, but they're just not recorded and put on the website. So none of that meeting is actually recorded, because I wouldn't like to go down a route where a committee of 7 met in another room, and then you wouldn't. The recording is at the discretion of the chair, but you're removing that discretion by moving it to a room that doesn't have recording facilities. So I think any meeting that is able and to be recorded should be held in here, unless you want to put recording equipment elsewhere, but I don't want to go down that route, I don't think.
The problem's really that's been highlighted is the limited options in terms of alternative venues with the facilities, where appropriate. Tom and then Roberta.
I agree with Ivan. I think that when it comes to, we sat in here one day and it was a teacher appealing against dismissal, and we're all in here, there was about 10 members plus officers, and we're basically sitting around this central part here, but you saw the rest of the room there, and I don't really think it's necessary to record something which is held in private in any case, particularly something like that. I'm quite easy about that one no being recorded. The committee room through there is ideal for that type of scenario. The only thing I would say about the place and time of meetings, etc., I mean, it is delegated to the Director of Chief Executive Services. I know there was talk about setting up a board of elected members to decide dates and times of meetings and what went on agendas, etc., etc., etc. Now, I don't know how far that talk got, but maybe elected members should be determining such things. Committee chair, for instance, should maybe decide that we want an extra meeting of this committee because the agenda is getting too full. So there is areas as to whether officers should decide date, times and agendas. Is that an appropriate thing, or should that be elected members making that decision?
To the best of my knowledge, it's always been something that's been consulted with the chair and vice chair, if it's a matter that's arisen at all. Roberta?
Well, just very briefly, my first comment is that it's not beyond the wit to reorganise part of this room into a smaller arrangement, to have more friendly meetings when there are appeals or anything else taking place. I mean, it's one of the concepts, the basic concepts of consulting with people, is you make them feel comfortable. So I don't see a problem with this room being reorganised properly.
Thank you. Item 9.
I could argue about this all day long, because sometimes he's wrong and he wouldn't accept it.
They're usually minor typos, Councillor McCottrey.
Okay, on page 30 of 34, Appendix 2, Scheme for appointment of representatives of churches, denominational bodies to nominate a person interested in the promotion of religious education to serve on the Education Committee. Claire brings to my attention that there's been a question around item 3, the penultimate paragraph on the page.
I think it's just obviously this was written back in 1973, but there's been an issue raised with the policy officer about what defines a church or denominational body in terms of the wider faiths who meet at a house. Perhaps they don't have a church or a building, official building that they meet at. They're effectively excluded from applying. At the recent religious rep vote meeting, it was a foregone conclusion who was going to be elected, basically. So Melinda Dolan asked me to raise it as an issue. It's maybe something that needs to go back to Scottish Government, I don't know, in terms of the definition of what is a church or denominational body. But it was just to raise it with you today. That's something maybe we have to take forward.
Thank you. Is this a matter that's arisen since 1970, whatever?
Just the last two, at 2007 and at 2012, it was raised by the Interfaith Group. But, you know, Alex's hands are tied as the proper officer and returning officer to the terms of the 73 Act. So it's something we need to take further, I think. It's not something the authority can really make a decision on.
Sorry? Right, Tom.
I see nothing wrong with reviewing it. I mean, it's been like that since time immemorial. We've got one Roman Catholic representative and two for the Proddies, and that's been it. And they've both been Church of Scotland. So it's made no account of Episcopalians or Methodists or Baptists or indeed Muslims, Jews. And I think that's the same right across Scotland, just because of that restriction there.
Nothing else on page 30 of 34, Appendix 2, no? Moving on to 31 of 34, Appendix 3. Any matters arising on that page? Page 32 of 34. Uncontested election, withdrawal of nominations, method of election, timetable. Any matters arising? And page 33 of 34. Item 9. Or casual vacancies, 10 and 11. No. Okay, thank you. Can we go back now to the recommendations? Recommendation 2.1, consider options for the review of the current scheme of administration and delegation to committees, paragraphs 5.1 and 5.4. We've done that. 2.2, dependent on the decision at 2.1 above, review the existing scheme of delegation, administration and delegation to committees appendix in light of the issues raised in the previous member consultation as detailed at 5.5, and to receive a further report with a revised draft scheme of administration and delegation to committee for further consideration. So all of our comments have been noted in terms of working our way through this paper. Unless any member has got anything in addition they would like to bring forward at this point. No? Jane?
I just want to know whether or not we think we've given sufficient of a steer, or whether we want to actually select specifics from either of these options to give a steer. I don't know whether we need to do that, or whether the discussions that we've had will be sufficient to indicate where we're going, detailed enough.
The notes going back to CMT, we'll look forward to the reports being brought forward to this committee as soon as possible, or at the next meeting. Oh, Ivor?
Just one thing, can we make sure it's cost neutral, any changes to any committees? Because if not, I might just invest in some shares in McBurney's removals, because they seem to be doing a good job for us just now.
I wouldn't say cost neutral, there might be a saving in there, Ivor.
I don't know about McBurney's, because I noticed this morning it was Pickford's across the road there, so it must be diversifying.
Okay, thanks very much, members. I've got no other business. Thanks very much for your attendance.